Right, folks. So we're moving on to decolonization here, and again, I really want to group these by region. So just a general overview before we get into decolonization in Africa. Let's just make sure we're all on the same page as to what decolonization is. Basically, it's an effort to break away from the imperial control that we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's an attempt to reclaim sovereignty, if you will. So, for the most part, these decolonization movements are stemmed by nationalism. Although what we see in Africa is that they really vary in success, and a lot of this has to do with continued ethnic tension within political boundaries. One of the things that's important for us to realize is that the era of imperialism drew boundaries, political boundaries in Africa that were not necessarily true to ethnicity. So there were conflicting tribes and other groups within countries. So nationalism was I guess, a little bit more of an amorphous term, since some people, they didn't see their national identity necessarily as something that synced up with the political borders that were drawn by Europeans. So in general, the continued divides between tribal, ethnic, and religious groups made just a general Pan-African movement really difficult. So what we see actually is that, again, as a general rule, decolonization in Africa was spurred by nationalism. And many actually of these movements were inspired by similar movements in the US and the Caribbean. So there was this general new movement called Pan-Africanism, or also negritude. So basically, the idea was this real move towards an embrace of African traditions, an emphasis of Black culture, a desire to, instead of to align one's identity with whatever political border they happen to live in, the idea is to embrace national heritage. So African nationalism is not necessarily confined to African borders. There was African nationalism in the United States. So, for example, thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois or Marcus Garvey, the members of the Black Power movement, they were all seen as Pan-African, even though they were in the United States. Many of them attempted to do things like name their children or traditionally African names. There was a fairly, eventually, especially when we get more towards the middle to the late 20th century, there's an effort for many people of African heritage to convert to Islam because that was their traditional religion before the legacy of slavery. So nonetheless, negritude is an idea that even if it is not confined to a particular political boundary, it's one that helps actually inspire people of African heritage throughout the globe. So it helped inspire Africans to turn away from European culture and colonial rule. Many African workers led strikes and protests against unfair labor practices in places like the Gold Coast and northern Rhodesia. And ultimately, some black nationalist movements we see did take a backseat during World War II. The idea was to really fight for your nation rather than your cultural identity. But there was some fighting in Africa during the war. So, for example, Operation Torch was entirely in North Africa, right? There were still white settlers in African colonies, which certainly made decolonization difficult. How do you reclaim your independence if former European colonialists are still there? Also, the policy of containment made imperial powers more oppressive in their efforts to prevent communism from taking root in Africa. So, despite the end of World War II, the Cold War mentality did make African independence pretty difficult. And that can be seen, I think, if we're looking at the different dates of independence in Africa. Despite the fact that we could date ourselves, we could go all the way back to the 14 points after World War I in 1918 and think, okay, Woodrow Wilson in 1918 was touting self-determination and independence. And yet we look at these dates and we realize that it really wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that countries in Africa really start to gain their independence. So to what extent, we could ask the question, did the policy of containment, did just the general Cold War tension lead to a desire for mainly European powers to maintain influence over African nations, again, to, in their mind, attempt to continue to prevent the spread of communism. So you see that there are only a handful of countries on this map that actually become independent before the end of World War II. Okay, so let's move on to talk about independence movements in a series of different countries. So let's start with Ghana. So Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain its independence. This happens in 1957. And its independence movement was led by Kwame Nkrumah. We see him pictured on the bottom. And he was the first prime minister of Ghana, and he later becomes president. So he developed political parties and a republican government in Ghana. And he uses nonviolent techniques. He's very much inspired by Gandhi. And so in the Ghana independence movement, we see that this is a much less violent movement than a lot of the other African independence movements that we'll talk about later. So, one of the things that Nkrumah really pushed for was a general sense of African unity and identity. He was inspired by African nationalism, Pan-Africanism, negritude, and in a lot of ways, his embrace of Pan-Africanism also inspires other African nations to move in this direction. In the next decade, after Ghanaian independence, more than 30 other African nations declare their independence from imperial rule. So other governments in Africa start to stress Pan-Africanism. They do things like take on more African-style dress, for example. And we'll look at this video actually in class. I don't want to do a video within a video. But this video that we'll look at is going to talk about the legacy of Nkrumah's leadership and why he still has some positive legacies in Africa. Now, there was a military coup in 1966, though, and Nkrumah was overthrown, and Ghana actually struggles between military and civilian rule until the year 2000. So the question, I suppose, is why does Nkrumah still have some positive legacies despite the 1966 coup over his leadership? There's actually some evidence that the CIA was involved in the coup. So we could ask the question about whether or not this was an extension of Cold War politics. Nkrumah himself identified as a Marxist, so many people think that the coup that overthrew Nkrumah was actually inspired more by containment policies than any effort to try to overthrow Nkrumah's actual popularity. In many instances, we're going to see that the U.S. and other Western powers might have actually been more likely to overthrow a democratically supported leader like Nkrumah solely because of his tendency to lean more towards a communist or a socialist government, that it seemed as though some of these powers were less interested in promoting democracy and more interested just in stopping the spread of communism. So moving on to Algeria, a much more bloody affair in the Algerian move for independence from France. So in the early stages of the Cold War, what's interesting is that France actually granted independence to several of its colonies in Africa, such as Morocco and Tunisia, but they were still determined to maintain a stronghold on Algeria. So we have to ask the question, well, why is that? Why were they willing to let go of their other colonies when they still wanted to hang on to Algeria? And a lot of this has to do with resettlement. Algeria had over 2 million French people that resettled there. So the French people demanded that the government in Paris support them, the French resettlers in Algeria. Their argument was that Algeria was essentially a part of France and it couldn't become a separate country because there were so many French people living there. But what we see is that after World War II ended, there's an increase of African nationalism, and this is, of course, present in Algeria. So in Algeria, there's this tension between French people living there and Algerian nationalists who want Algeria to become an independent nation. In 1945, there were peaceful protests in the town of Sétif, and this results in police fire and Algerian riots in response. So this peaceful protest in this town of Sétif results in the deaths of more than 8,000 Algerian Muslims and 100 French people. So basically, the Sétif massacre gives further fuel to Algerian nationalism against French rule. And this automatically shows us that the process for Algerian independence is going to be much bloodier than what we just saw in Ghana previously. So, basically, the move for Algerian independence then turns to war. In 1954, the National Liberation Front, abbreviated the NLF, was developed in Algeria, and it's very similar to the one that was founded in Vietnam. So they also rely on guerrilla tactics in the countryside, and gradually they start to move into more urban areas. By 1958, the French sent more than 500,000 soldiers into war with Algeria. So this also is a civil war between French loyalists in Algeria and nationalists. Some Algerians actually fought on the French side and were forced to kill their own people. So this is also the complication with decolonization. When you have movement of European people into their colonial nations, oftentimes there's a divide between the people in these nations. Some of them don't really want decolonization. They see a benefit in maintaining the ties to their colonial nations. Guerrilla war tactics and torture were used on both sides of the Algeria independence movement. And in 1962, Algeria finally gains independence, but hundreds of thousands of Algerians died in the conflict. I also forgot to mention one thing that's probably important to mention, is that the same year that the National Liberation Front was established in Algeria, that's the same year, actually, that the French decide to pull out of Vietnam. So the French are certainly struggling to maintain hold of many of their colonial possessions at the same time. And the French population continues to be divided over Algeria, largely due to human rights violations. And when a new French president is elected, when Charles de Gaulle was elected, he actually bypassed the French National Assembly, and he went straight to the people of France with a referendum for Algerian independence. So Algeria becomes officially independent in 1962. But nonetheless, there will be a civil war in Algeria that I want to talk about just in a second. But first, I believe your book mentioned this, so just important for us to mention some of the cultural impacts and also the shapers of the Algerian independence movement. So let's talk about Frantz Fanon for just a second. He's mentioned in the reading. He wrote a book in 1961 called The Wretched of the Earth, and he encouraged the use of violence against colonial oppressors. Now, Fanon dies before Algeria achieved independence, but he's still seen as a really important movement and the force, and encouraged other independence movements in colonial nations. So nonetheless, you also see, cultural contributors to independence movements. Sorry, I just realized I don't have anything additional written down about the Algerian Civil War, but nonetheless, violence in Algeria continues even after Algeria achieves its independence. After Algerian independence in 1962, French Algerians flee the country as refugees, and what we see is that there's actually an anti-immigration sentiment in France because of this. The National Liberation Front in Algeria established a single-party state, and they maintained a socialist, authoritarian government that repressed dissent. In 1991, there was a reaction against single-party rule, and the Islamic Salvation Front gained victories in an election that was subsequently canceled. Now, this civil war in Algeria continues until 2002, and eventually the military chose a president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and suicide bombings by insurgents continue. And it wasn't until 2011 that a state of emergency was lifted due to protests in the wake of uprisings in nearby states, including Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And this all was during the Arab Spring. So it's important for us to realize that despite the fairly early independence date of 1962, Algeria is a country that continues to experience quite a bit of internal and external dissent. In many ways, we could see the legacy of the Algerian Civil War contributing to a lot of anti-foreign and anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe that we still see happening today. Let's take a break and then we'll move on to South Africa and Kenya in the next series of videos. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.